I realized that I was making the hiring decisions based on fear. So the fear of getting told by this investor that, oh, we don't look a certain way. And I also actually had a secret fear that I didn't really tell anyone about. But my fear was that, as I told you, I have a chemical engineering background and one that was focused more on materials, polymers, than biology. I actually knew very, very little about biology. And the previous CEO, she was the one who had a microbiology background. And here I was trying to run a biotechnology company. I understood a certain level, but I didn't really understand what the majority of our scientists were working on. So
Uh-huh.
I had that fear so much. And then combined with my investors' fear of the fact that I'm young, I'm inexperienced, I'm a scientist, therefore I must not know business. That I think led me to make some of the wrong decisions.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of Lab to Startup. I took a small hiatus from podcasting as I was focusing on my two kids who just turned 1 and 4 years old. And also, I was busy launching a new startup, which I'll probably talk more about when the time is appropriate. And no, I won't stop podcasting. This is a place where I learn a lot from all the founders and those supporting those founders. And without further ado, my guest today is Chaeyoung Shin, the co-founder and CEO of NAMUH, a startup that was on a mission to close the gap between human breast milk and infant formula. They were recreating the bioactive molecules produced in breast milk that have a vital role in infant health and development. Before embarking startup journey, Chaeyoung earned her Ph.D. in chemical engineering from UC Berkeley. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the origins of NAMUH, Chaeyoung's transition to becoming the CEO, lessons learned from team building and fundraising, and go a little deeper into infant food industry itself, and end with some of the big takeaways from Chaeyoung's journey. We also talk about the perceptions of some investors about PhD founders and the need to stop stereotyping scientists as not good CEOs, because I continue to have the pleasure of speaking with phenomenal founders I bring on as guests on my show, and almost all of them have a PhD. I would like to request investors not to walk in with the negative perceptions when you talk to one of these PhD founders. Chaeyoung is very special to me because if you notice, I've been using some past tense in my grammar. It is because the company ceased its operations recently. I say special because even after shutting down the startup, she was willing to share some of the lessons to benefit other people. I've personally learned a lot about the infant formula industry and some of the reasons why it is hard to break into the space. Hope it is equally educational to you all, especially for those who plan to enter the space and those building startups in general. Chaeyoung, welcome to the show. Super excited to have you here to talk about your startup, NAMUH. I think a good place to start this conversation could be talk about the problem you're solving at the startup, and you can transition into the technology that you guys develop, and we can take it from there.
Thanks for having me, Naresh. So it saddens me to use the past tense, but NAMUH was a company trying to address the nutritional gap between infant formula and human breast milk. As you know, the infant formula and human breast milk, they carry a lot of differences between them. And we looked at it closely from a scientific perspective. A lot of those challenges we were able to address by the new technologies that have been coming out. So our goal was to really come up with the technological solutions on how to recreate those nutrients that are only available in human breast milk in a very cost-effective way, and then to put them in our infant formula and deliver them to customers.
Great. So let me understand this. This is going to be another additive that was going to baby formula that is available in the market. Was that the goal?
Absolutely. And it's not just one additive, it's
Mm.
actually a class of additives called the human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs in short, which are the fiber equivalents of human breast milk. There are actually more of these HMOs present in human breast milk than there are proteins. So it's not a trivial, small amount, small quantity thing, but it's a big class of nutrients that have not been addressed that well yet.
And how is the market addressing that problem right now? Do they have nothing of that sort?
Most of the formulas have nothing, although the big players have started to come up with premium formulas that include in some amounts of those HMOs. So it's
All right.
just starting to move, but not at the pace that we wanted it to move, because we wanted to put it HMOs exactly at the levels of how much it was found in human breast milk. We were going to spare no cost and really match the nutritional level of human breast milk.
Say more about the HMOs, the significance, and how you are going to solve this problem.
It is a fiber equivalent. What it does is it really selectively feeds the good gut microbes inside a baby's gut. And it really shapes, develops, and sets a tone for the baby's gut microbiome for the rest of their lives. And it's really, really crazy how nature addressed this problem, because we, by evolution, produce these fiber-like molecules in large, large quantities, much larger than any of the other mammals out there, actually. And they're really good at selectively feeding it. The reason why it's so important for babies is that babies are born pristine, so with zero gut microbiota. And it's really for the first couple of years of their lives when the gut microbiota develops. So it's nature's way of ensuring that that happens in the right way. It is also set to affect a lot of the outcomes between human breast milk fed babies and formula fed babies. And it is one of the really secret key magic that human breast milk has.
Wow. It sounds so important. I believe it 100%. And it's just fascinating that we haven't come up with a solution for that. And what were you guys working on? How are you trying to solve the problem?
So we were using our yeast fermentation technology to really create a precision fermentation technology to recreate those HMOs in a fermentation vessel. And the co-founding team, we used to work together during my PhD times, working on yeast fermentations to produce biofuels. So now, after graduating, we just use very similar but the core concepts of precision fermentation and repurposed it to produce HMOs.
Fascinating. You mentioned about grad school training in this process. You're using this for biofuels. Say more about that training. What were you working on? I think that'll set the stage for other people who are listening to, and how you're able to use some of those technologies into this startup here.
I'm a chemical engineer by training. I trained to be a polymer physicist. So pretty different from where I ended up as. And I was making these polymeric membranes to separate biofuels from biofuel fermentation. It turns out we actually don't need these polymeric membranes, are not applicable for separation in HMO. So actually none of my core expertise was used directly for this company, but I think what came along with it was my understanding of how experiments are designed, my core understanding of fermentation processes. I was able to recycle at the company.
One of the premises for this podcast is the training that helps the PhDs that they go through and how they're able to learn and think better, grasp better, and apply that to something else. And I think that's a nice segue to talk about your startup journey. How did you end up with the startup?
It's a very not so exciting startup story. I wish I really had an inspiration. I woke up one day and really got the idea to save babies and started it. How exciting would that be? But I was just applying for different jobs when I was about to graduate. I was mainly looking at startups because, hey, it's the Bay Area. That's a cool thing to do. And one of the companies that I applied to got back to me and told me that, hey, I actually know you. And she turned out to be another grad student who was working on the same floor as me. And it turns out that they were a very, very brand new company. And they were actually looking for a fourth co-founder who had a chemical engineering background. And since I knew that person for quite some time, and I knew the professors who were involved with the new company, the people are great. I trust them. I don't have any good ideas to start a company. And when would I ever get another chance to co-found a company? So I just joined them, and things started progressing in different ways that I had not expected. I had no idea what co-founding a company actually meant, but it meant a lot of different things.
That is a great story. I think that's a norm. You look at startups. Some people do look at the big biotech companies too. Okay, what was that transition like? So you joined as a fourth co-founder in the startup. What were you doing initially in the company building process? And what was the rest of the team looking like? I'm trying to understand the dynamics of what each person was bringing to the table and how the company was growing from there.
For the first couple of years, every day was just a surprise and more responsibilities growing. So at first, I thought I was only going to do chemical engineering related experiments. So I started out doing the experiments, but hey, it was a two-person company at that time. So hey, who's going to reach out to the customers? Oh, actually, I have a little bandwidth. Let me reach out to the customers. And then it grew from there onwards, just a little bit more of learning new things and taking on more responsibilities. And then to our disappointment, my predecessor, the previous CEO of the company, she had to relocate back home because of family issues that came up for her unexpectedly. So I had to take over as CEO after a year into the company. So there was a really big difference between what I had imagined, just working inside the lab, to not only overlooking the science parts of the company, but also doing fundraising and doing business development, basically taking care of every other aspect of the company.
This sounds scary and fascinating at the same time. Here you are trying to find a job, and then you find a startup to work with, and suddenly you're in the CEO's seat. I think one common thread with most of the startups that I interview has been that you're a scientist, but then when you come in, you're the accountant, you're the janitor, you're doing everything, you're the customer developer for the company. If anything stood out in that phase before becoming a CEO in terms of your experience doing things outside of your science, what was the toughest part and what was the fun part?
It's a great question. The toughest part would be the stigma around scientists becoming entrepreneurs. And I call it a stigma because I don't think it's real. Not the stigma part, but I don't think there's any problem or any additional difficulties of scientists becoming entrepreneurs. Yet the rest of the world doesn't think so. So being constantly told that you're going to suck at doing business, that was really tough. The fun part was proving them wrong.
I hear you. I hear you. I had to go through that journey, and people told me that you won't be a good CEO. And it was tough. You tried something new, something big. You understand the technology. But I'm glad you understood the stigma and you became the CEO and you're fighting them. Tell me more about the CEO role in there. Let's move forward from the journey. How did you start building the team at that point? But before that, what was the funding situation when you took on as a CEO?
I had 5 months of runway left when I took on as CEO, and we had been actively fundraising at that time. It was not such a good time for the previous CEO to leave. She couldn't control it. None of us had control over that. But unfortunately, we had pitched to most of the investors that we were targeting to pitch to, and to try to convince them to come back. Even if the CEO leaves, it's fine. Just come
Yeah.
back. I can be a good CEO. Proving that to them was very, very difficult. So I just thought, okay, maybe I'll be CEO for 5 months. And again, that mentality of when will I ever become CEO
Yeah.
was how I approached it. And we got extremely lucky at meeting an investor that really believed in me and in our business. So we were fortunate enough to go on with the company for not just 5 months, but more than 5 years.
Wow. You mentioned you had 5 months of runway. What was the initial funding like? Where did you get the first seed money from?
We started out with the NSF funding, the SBIR phase one from NSF is how we started out. And then we joined an incubator program called IndieBio, which is in San Francisco. And there we got our first batch of investor funding. And then it was the next round that we were preparing for when
Okay.
I took over as CEO.
So here we are. You had some investor that believed in you and you started building the team again. How was that team building experience? What was your first hire like? And what were you thinking in terms of the skills this person might need as you're the one man, one woman person team at that point?
Well, we did have a couple of scientists already on board, but team building, man, it was really hard. And I think at that point, I was inexperienced, didn't fully understand how shaken up my team was, the two
Mm.
scientists that we had by the previous CEO leaving. I didn't know, to be honest with you. So in order to stabilize the current team while bringing on new team and molding them together, that was really, really challenging. And here were all those people telling me that I don't know business. So everyone had different ideas on who I should bring on.
Mm.
And I think I tried and failed a couple of times, but it was honestly, unfortunately, by trial and error that I learned how to build the team.
Okay. So I think that is rough. I think when a CEO leaves, investors mostly trust in the CEOs when they first invest. I think that is what they're betting the money on. And I think that takes the trust. It must have been very hard for you to build that trust again and then stabilize that team. So a couple of hires didn't work out. What were the decisions you made in terms of hiring them? What did you learn in terms of your decisions being not so right? What were
Um,
your assumptions there? This is a common story. I think we don't understand hiring. Grad school doesn't tell us about that. We'll go to that training a little later, but I'm just trying to understand your psychology of what you thought, what your hypothesis was when you brought on somebody, and why it didn't turn out right.
I realized that I was making the hiring decisions based on fear. So the fear of getting told by this investor that, oh, we don't look a certain way. And I also actually had a secret fear that I didn't really tell anyone about. But my fear was that, as I told you, I have a chemical engineering background and one that was focused more on materials, polymers, than biology. I actually knew very, very little about biology. And the previous CEO, she was the one who had a microbiology background. And here I was trying to run a biotechnology company. I understood a certain level, but I didn't really understand what the majority of our scientists were working on. So
Uh-huh.
I had that fear so much. And then combined with my investors' fear of the fact that I'm young, I'm inexperienced, I'm a scientist, therefore I must not know business. That I think led me to make some of the wrong decisions. Versus now, if I were to go back and do it again, I would try to map out the organization that I would like to build and start from a certain place and then starting hiring from there, not just grab someone or give an offer to someone just out of fear.
Fear. Oh my God. We founders have so many fears that we can't even speak to because people might think we are ignorant. Investors might not believe us anymore. But did you have a support system that you were able to openly talk to at that point? What was that support system look like? And how did that evolve from that point on?
The support system that I met was through my network of fellow founders that I met at IndieBio. Yeah, actually. And then onwards, it grew from there. Really, there are certain things that founders only understand. And a lot of times you can't disclose everything to your colleagues within the company as well. So it was very helpful to be able to have that network of people that I could just call up and be really, really honest about my fears and etc. I wish I'd done more of that actually, because as scientists, I wasn't used to discussing my feelings about the research that I was doing with my fellow scientists, but I realized that it's something that I have to identify and really talk about in order for me to get over.
Yeah. I was just reading Bill Gurley's tweets the other day. He talks about it all the time. Try to find a network who have traveled this journey at least 2 or 3 years ahead of you so that it'll be easier. I think talking to the people in your own cohort in an incubator is all right. But I think everybody is scared that they're not so knowledgeable. It's a common fear, I think. And our academic training is so siloed in grad school. A reaction might not work. We can't talk about it to your professor because my professor might have a brown thumb for reactions. I learned it the hard way. Anyways, but as you evolve building the company, were you able to build a better network to support you? And what would that support system look like?
Absolutely. As you said, it started out with very similar level founders, but then some progressed faster, some progressed slower in their companies growing. And then through that network, I also met other founders, some much further along, and then some early on as well as time passed. And that really gave me a lot better perspective. Also, there are a lot of, I guess, founder networks out there. So I got to meet with some founders who are on the other side of the coast as well. And I still try to do that now because I know that that support system is really important.
Absolutely. Let's stick to this subject of team. How big was the team at the highest point? How did you improve in that process in deciding whom to hire? And if there is a question or two that is going to make or break a hire?
So we were at about 13, 14. I'm a little fuzzy on that because we had a lot of
That's fine.
part-timers at that point, and most of the people were scientists or associate scientists working with the scientists. And it's the team hiring and team building. It's something that I'm still trying to ponder on. It's an art, really, and it's about balance and some really big learnings. Sorry, to answer your question, I don't have a question that I use to really judge the candidates.
Maybe a framework that you created as you evolved as a
Yeah,
leader?
yeah. So that framework would be, what would the organization look like? And try to have even a persona or try to make up a best candidate in mind. Because when you're really desperate, you try to bend the rules a little bit and you're like, oh, this is good enough. So it's very hard to set who you're trying to hire for if you don't define it beforehand. So defining that persona person with the experience, defining it, and then also defining which of these criteria am I willing to bend on or concede on, or which of this is a nice to have and which of these are must haves. And then really having a defined process for choosing the candidate and not just, oh, we need a scientist. Roughly, this is what we need. And, oh, this person looks really nice and sweet. Let's hire them. Not like that.
Did the gut ever play a role, the gut feeling part of it? And did you go against it or did you go with it? How did that turn out?
Gut feelings don't work for me. Sometimes it does work, but sometimes it doesn't.
I never asked this question to anybody because most of the time I feel like I'm right, but I'm just trying to get some data points of what others feel about it.
Yeah, because you also have this framework on how your brain works. And just relying on your own gut feeling, that will just lead you to make comfortable decisions and not look outside the box. If it feels super bad, then you probably shouldn't go with it. But you should try to ask yourself at the very least, why am I feeling bad?
I want to take a step back, and you were getting advice about the hires you should be making initially, whether it is the investors or the advisors. What was the advice? Because you're a scientist. You said you didn't have too much expertise in the biotech part of it. What was the recommendation like?
The good thing was that a lot of my investors weren't also biologists. So they actually understood very little of how inexperienced I was in the technology part. So they're like, oh, Ph.D, chemical engineering, that's close enough. You know the science. So that was my fear because I didn't know what plasmids were. It was really bad. So when I wanted to address the science part of the company, the investors were basically telling me, you need a business person. You need someone older, wiser, and male. Not saying
and
that
male
is bad.
People didn't hear that, yes.
I did give in to, if someone makes recommendations that I can't refute very directly. It was very true that I was inexperienced in business. And it was very true that I never had a very experienced business person working with me. And even though I felt like, okay, the science part is the priority, sure, why don't we try this person out? So I did give in quite a few times because I come from a culture where it's very rude to say no.
Yeah. This is crazy. I'm going to double click on the subject because I think in a deep tech startup, right, there are two kinds of risks. One is a technology risk and there's a market risk, the business side of risk. And it so happens that when scientists start a company, the technology is not there yet. And you need to spend so much time just refining the technology, getting to that minimum viable product. Or I don't even think it's a minimum viable product in biotech. The product needs to be fucking ready. You can't give a half-baked product and see how it works, like a drug or a diagnostic, or in this case, your polymers here. It's just crazy that people try to push a business person on the team when they haven't sorted out the technology aspect of it. I really hope investors take a closer look at this, and some programs just push like, oh, you're a scientist, let's bring a MBA student and marry you guys so you'll build a company. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm going to state it on my podcast here, but I hope people change that. I hope we get a little leeway in terms of technology development and de-risking that part of it. I think that's a good segue to talk about. You mentioned the incubators. I think incubators serve a good purpose of teaching you startup skills. What are the biggest lessons you learned? And I've seen on your journey that you've been through a few incubators or accelerators. If you can touch on the subject of the accelerators and incubators you work with and the lessons you took away from them.
For that purpose, IndieBio, the main incubator program that we were part of, really was helpful because one of their mottos is that they turn scientists into entrepreneurs. And they did that, with me at least. And they do a lot of those things where they tell us that we can do it. So they're not shooting us down like a lot of other investors were, saying that we can't do it. You need a business person or an MBA student to be paired up with you. Instead of doing that, they taught us what it means to be an entrepreneur and what we need to know. Now, I do think that at the end of the day, some scientists are just, oh, I don't want to do business. And I don't want that. So I do recognize that some scientists just purely want to stay in the technology part. And in that case, sure, being paired up with someone who has a business mind. Honestly, if they only like science, then I wonder why they're running a startup anyways. But I do recognize that there are some good cases for it. But oftentimes, the reason why I strongly believe that it is the founder or the person who developed the technology and who decided to start the company that should be in the CEO seat, at least in the very beginning, is that no one else will understand your technology. And it's not just moving and developing the technology. It's the only person who's able to think about what your technology can bring and really turn it into a business, and who has that passion would be the founder themselves. And initially, it's about the vision of the company. We don't have to show too much business traction in order to get the company started. And really, I feel like the vision is something that no one else but the founder can convey the best. So as long as the founder is very open to learning about business and how to speak in business language and etc., I think that is completely possible. So I also don't like seeing technical founders being pushed to take MBA students or someone else from the business world as CEO.
Yeah.
I don't like that either.
I just want to put a caveat there. I don't have anything against MBAs or business people coming on board. It's just that if they have the right experience, if they have the complementary skills, I think they'll be a great value add at that point. But that was IndieBio. I know Ryan Bethencourt and Arvind Gup, great people. I think I need to bring Arvind on the show. But what about the other incubators you had to go through?
All the other incubators, I don't believe we've officially gotten any investments from them, but we got affiliated with a lot of different programs and participated in a lot of their events, which was amazing for networking. And the other incubators, we also used to connect with different founders, investors, and different businesses. So it was a really great networking opportunity. So if there's someone who was like me when I first started the company, I would very highly recommend being part of at least some incubator program to whatever extent, because they also have different levels of participation. But that networking opportunity was very valuable.
Yeah, these incubators bring phenomenal networks. I think that's the biggest value they bring, if not money. But speaking about who you are, you mentioned you're an immigrant, a female founder, launching a startup for the first time. Talk more about the challenges from each of these backgrounds. I'm an immigrant as well. I'm not a female. Luckily, I couldn't experience what you have experienced. So let's take down each of these verticals, the challenges that brought and how you overcame those, and if there are any lessons learned for other people. Let's talk about the being an immigrant part of it. You couldn't say no to people. How about that? Let's start there.
I think it's a immigrant and being a woman part of it. Because I come from a culture where women and younger people are not, it's rude to say no. So I think that part played a big role. And I would love to try someday to separate out the immigrant and the female part and being young, being a scientist. But for me, I've experienced all of those simultaneously.
Together, right?
So it's actually a little bit hard for me to dissect down to, oh, this is because I was an immigrant, and this is more related to this because I was all of them at once embodied. So for example, if an investor saw me, we just shook hands. And before I could even pitch, if he would say something like, oh, but you have a PhD. Oh, you're a scientist. You're not an entrepreneur. I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know if it's because I was a female scientist. I don't know if it was because of a female scientist who was young or because I was a scientist. So it's very hard. And these are all very nuanced. And I think the biggest part that brought me down was just on the numbers, because you can find for yourself online that female entrepreneurs raise less than 2% of all the VC funding. So that really did bring me down. And then I asked myself, am I just trying to do a really hard and dumb thing? Is this not going to work? So those doubts, I think, were actually the hardest for me. But I also learned that thinking about them when I pitch does not really help me. When I pitch, really thinking about how I can give the best pitch to these investors who are sitting in front of me helped me. And even though the world is very stigmatized, very biased, I actually try not to think about that in my day-to-day and try to focus on the business and the products and about the things that I can control. But it's on these podcasts and when I get to talk about these issues that I try to voice my opinions, that this shouldn't be the way. People are missing out on a lot of great opportunities as well. That's when I try to help fix the problem and address it.
Yeah, thinking about those challenges, which you have no control on, it's very sad. The levels of VC funding for female founders. But I had some phenomenal founders on my podcast so far, and I think they've done a great job. I hope it changes that way for the better. I know it's hard to separate those things. Maybe a different question could be, speaking of investors, what were helpful investors looking like when you interacted with them, and not so helpful investors? I'm looking for signals here for anybody who's going to be a female founder or immigrant. We'll stick to that class for now because we have a lot of them. If they go to an investor and you hear something from them, it never turned out good. And how do you say no to these people and just walk away, not waste too much time? I used to waste so much time just following up with emails. I was a first time founder too. But if there are any lessons learned, let's stick to the investor part of it.
I try to set the fundraising part in a very strict process way, at least at the end, after I had some years of experience, and try to pitch. I would not throw away an investor unless they explicitly came on to me or made sexual comments or something that crossed the line for me. I would not even follow up with them. But those are very few. And the others, they were less explicit, but I would still try to follow up with them. But the part that I tried to do was I would just schedule all the follow-ups, do it in a mechanical way instead of wasting my emotions, do it in a mechanical way. And if they don't respond after a few, just crossing them out. But having it be built in such a process that they would be the first to go. And luckily, I don't think I had too many investors who still continued to take on meetings and still wasted my time that way. So I don't think I had too many of those. I was lucky, I guess, and that a lot of the investors who weren't interested just passed very quickly, or I was able to get them to pass.
Yeah. I think you bring up a very good point about just it being a mechanical follow-up and not putting too much emotion. I was talking to an investor on my show and he said, venture capitalists don't have a heart, so don't try to put emotion into interaction with those people. That's a good lesson, I think. Some of the first-time founders spend too much time and effort spending a lot of emotion and wasting on that front. That's a nice lesson to take away. One other related question, mentors and advisors. You must have picked up a few of them, but then you must have got advice from a lot of people. I think everybody that we talk to about a startup wants to give an advice, and there's so much noise out there. They don't understand the technology, they don't understand the business, but they have something to say. How did you separate signal from the noise there, if you got both of them?
It's a great question. And you're right. Everyone wanted to give me a piece of advice, even strangers. And as someone who takes advice to heart, it was very confusing for me when I would get completely opposite advices. But then over time, you can see some themes emerging from those tons of advices that you get. And a lot of times, if those themes converged on a problem, for example, let's bring on that problem of me not having enough business experience. People would tell me, oh, you don't have enough business experience, so you should get a VP of business development. Or some people might say, oh, you don't have enough business experience, you should get an independent board member who has business experience. Or you should get a board chairman who has a lot of business experience. So a lot of different solutions. But then the theme of that Chaeyoung doesn't have enough business experience, that was there. And in a lot of cases, I realized that the problems they were pointing out or indirectly pointing out are often right. Because it's right. I don't have enough business experience. But then what could be very, very divergent and noisy could be the solutions that they provide. People love providing solutions. So over time, I tried to filter out, okay, what's the problem that I'm hearing? And what are the different solutions? And which of these solutions is noise and which of these is actually right? Because I feel like if you're running a company, sometimes you even miss some of the problems that you have. And it's really helpful if you get external feedback that point out the problems. However, in a lot of these cases, people don't know anything about your business. So the solutions that they suggest would oftentimes be wrong. And it's for you to come up with the solutions. Sorry, that was a long way for me to say that usually the problems are correct. Now, the problem analysis might also be wrong because people might say, oh, this is happening because of this. This is because of this. Anything related to problem diagnosis and problem solutions are very, very noisy, but then the problem itself is correct in a lot of cases.
I think I still get flustered when I hear solutions from somebody who's nothing to do with the business, but they'll just throw on their problem and tell you how and why your business will fail. I think I need to control my emotions and not spend too much on that front. Yeah, I know we digress a lot into the business building part of it. I want to go back to after you took over the company as a CEO. Talk about the evolution of that journey in terms of the science there. And I think you changed the name of the company to Sugar Logics. What was happening in that process there?
So we were already Sugar Logics.
Okay.
Then eventually we changed our name to
Oh,
NAMUH.
my
Yeah,
bad.
no worries. Sugar Logics to NAMUH was a name change. And what I tried to really work hard on was defining our business model. And I think we unfortunately took a lot longer time than we could have done to really find the business model that worked just right for the company. Infant formula is a very unique business. It's not quite pharma, but it's not quite regular food either. It's somewhere in between those two. And it's a very niche business that only a few companies are in. So it has its own rules and behaviors that we could not have foreseen. And once we saw it, we needed to make some adjustments to our business model to really be successful in this industry. So that was what caused our name change from being Sugar Logics to NAMUH. And with it, we changed our business model from a B2B focus model to a B2C focus model.
Oh, wow. I think there's so much to talk. Let's go down this thread. The business model. What was the hypothesis when you first took over as a CEO and what you thought were the customers and how it evolved to a B2C and what that customer profile was going to look like and what that business model was?
So our business model initially, when I started out as CEO, was that we'll be building this precision fermentation technology to create the human milk oligosaccharides and sell them. We'd be selling the HMOs as ingredients to infant formula companies was our original business model. What I did not quite realize was how viable that plan was. And I realized shortly after becoming CEO that we weren't addressing our customers' pain points. We were addressing the parents' pain point. Sure, they want better infant formula. But as a B2B business, we were trying to sell our ingredients to the infant formula companies. And what do the infant formula companies want was what I pondered over a lot and talked to a lot of people about. And yes, it's not like they want to make formula that's unhealthy. I would never say that. But they have a lot of boundary conditions. So for parents, it might be, I want to feed my baby best nutrition, whatever the cost is. But then for infant formula companies, it would be the best amount of nutrition. However, we have this budget here and then this budget here. So there was a lot of budget constraints that we did not foresee.
That was a big problem. And maybe I should ask this question too. What is the knowledge level of both these potential customers, the formula companies and the parents? How much did they know about the HMOs? How much did you have to educate them? And talk about the challenges or surprises in that space if you had to educate them.
With the formula companies, not so much because they knew about HMOs. They're present in human breast milk. They've been doing the researches forever. And with the parents, a lot, actually. They know that formula is inferior to breast milk. Actually, there are a lot of organizations that make it very scary. They have this list of scary diseases and conditions that are associated with formula feeding. And I think it's awful for the parents because the parents can't make infant formula. They can't change anything about it. So it's a very stigmatized, and also it brings about a lot of guilt to parents who choose to infant formula feed, which really they don't deserve. They should not feel that way. But because they're not nutritional experts, they don't quite know what is different.
Your conversations with the customers in the B2B space, baby formula companies, what were those interviews like when you're trying to understand their needs and coming up with a business model? How open were they in terms of leading you in the right direction? Any good takeaways from those customer interviews? How many companies did you talk to? If there are any lessons learned while talking to them in terms of this is a better approach to ask them questions?
We talked to all of them. There aren't that many. So less than 10, I should say. I think more than like 7, 8. And through those interviews, we learned how those companies think because they're thinking about what would it take for our formulas to sell really well. And again, it's a little bit of a different objective than how do we make this as nutritious as possible. They overlap, but it's slightly different. And then we also learned a lot about the government program that these formula companies sell to. Basically, 50% of the infant formula in the US is purchased by the US government. So how that created a big impact for these companies. And through their questions, what was it that they were really worried or concerned or cared about as well?
You mentioned budgets seem to be a problem in terms of intake of your nutritional additions. I have no idea about the profit margins of these companies. Was it going to be really affected by adding your nutritional additives?
Yes, I
Okay.
think so. At the very least, at the level that was present in human breast, if they try to match that level, it was going to change
Uh,
dramatically what their profit margin was, or they would have to increase the formula
mm,
prices as well. And that's also very hard to do. And is it moral to do? It's a very complicated problem for them. And I really feel with the big infant formula companies as well. I don't think they're being evil companies or they're trying to do something that is very immoral. No, they're public companies. They try to do best for their shareholders. And they also try to make formulas affordable for people as well. So it's a very complex problem that they were just trapped in. And when I realized how complex that problem was and how much entrapped they were, actually, that's when it hit me. There's got to be a new infant formula company.
Thank you for that. Thank you for explaining that. I don't have no knowledge about this space. So that takes me to the next question about when you were building this HMOs, what did you have in your mind in terms of like the cost? And how did you decide that if the formula companies cannot afford this, move to the customers directly? Talk about that journey there.
Oftentimes it's about the delta. So big companies, even if they have very, very luxurious margins, if their profit falls, then they're not doing good,
The
right?
quarterly results are going to go down.
It's about the delta of
Mhm.
their business. So if we ask them to, okay, why don't you include in all these HMOs at human breast milk levels? Then they're going to say no because their profits are going to go down. But if we ask a question of, okay, if we produce formulas that had HMOs at human breast milk levels, would it make a profitable company? The answer is yes. It's just that it's not as profitable as their
Yeah.
current model, and they can't move away from that not so easily without external pushes. But for us as a new company, we were free to really define our profit margin model and really define courses with it. Also, the fact that biotechnology gets refined every time. So even though our first manufacturing batch might be this level efficient, the next level could be more and more efficient. But then while we couldn't wait for the formula companies to ask for them to be patient, and why don't you suffer through bad profit margins while our
Yeah.
efficiencies grow? While we couldn't ask for them that, we could ask ourselves, we're going to not have great profit margins, but it's going to be better over time.
I want to go back to one point you mentioned about your company falling between the food and the pharma companies. In between that, where does regulation come in this? How hard was the regulatory aspect of it? And communicating that to the customers. We'll take it as two questions. Talk about the regulatory aspect of it.
So the hardest part was, again, the stigma around regulations. People, investors especially, they assume that infant formula would be highly, highly regulated. We would take a lot of money to go through the clinical trials, which is true compared to food, but compared to pharma, it's a very low bar, actually. Such a low bar that I feel like the regulatory barrier should be higher, even. And yes, if you come up with a new formulation, you have to go through a clinical trial where you feed a bunch of babies, your new formulation. But then the primary endpoints that you mainly check for is the weight gain and the head circumference growth and the overall general level of sickness. So if those three things are checks, then
Yeah.
it's good to go. And with the weight gain and the head circumference growth, there's only a lower bar and not an upper bar, which hurts my soul because it indirectly is encouraging formula companies to
Yeah.
make babies more obese and or push them in the direction of that. So, and it's a very low bar compared to a drug or any pharmaceuticals. It doesn't take that much amount of funding either, and it's a very short trial as well. So it's exactly in the middle of food and pharma.
I agree with you. I think it should have been a bit more stringent. I have two little babies. I just don't want to put anything in their body without a stringent testing process. Long term effects too. I think that's a nice segue to talk about the customer part of it. How were your interactions with dealing with the customers directly, and how were you able to convince them? And what challenges did you have while interacting with them and convincing them?
So as a B2B business, we were not too successful in getting customers. Also, not to mention that the big infant formula companies asked us, okay, can you provide us tons of the material? And we were like, been a few years. So we didn't make that much traction with them. And also with the complications of the current infant formula industry, we decided to pivot into becoming an infant formula player ourselves. and to really launch our products directly to customers. We never made it to launch. So on that part as well, I don't have too much to share in terms of customers. But what I can only share in terms of our B2C experience was our interactions with initial moms or parents who are interested in our products. Theoretically, no one purchased anything. So I would call them theoretical customers. And we got to hear a lot of pain points about breastfeeding and how difficult it was to really get infant formulas and how very confusing the nutritional part was, because by reading the infant formula labels, it's really hard for parents to decide, oh, this is close enough, or this is really far away from my breast milk, or whatever. It's very hard. So the pain points we got to hear a lot about.
Nobody is that educated. I think there should be a chart about what is in the breast milk and what is lacking in this one. At least they have some understanding. Nothing that talks about this. And were you ever able to broach the subject of pricing when you talk to these mothers and other potential customers? I ask this question because startups, it's a hard question to bring up pricing. You don't know if you're pricing it low or too high. How did you deal with that concept or subject?
When we were a B2B business, pricing came up as one of the first things, and it was very transparent. We would say one number and they would be like, nope. Or they would say one number and we were like, we can't do that, or something along those lines. For parents as well, we never approached them in terms of, this is the price of it, would you buy? We never did any surveys like that. However, we asked them, how do you choose your current infant formulas? We also talked to them about, okay, what would be the range that you would be comfortable with in terms of infant formula? And surprisingly, a lot of the moms, sorry, I just say moms because it was mainly moms that we talked to. I don't mean to be non-inclusive, but a lot of parents that we talked to actually said that because they don't know anything about nutrition, they just assume that the most expensive ones have the best nutrition. So they actually buy the most expensive one, and that's it. And they would be like, I don't know. And they didn't really seem to have an end point. So the couple of dollars per can didn't seem to matter that much, at least for the group of parents that we talked to. And also we realized that price was a strong indicator of quality in this market. So we were actually going to be pricing our infant formula at a pretty high price, but at about a tenth of the price that black market breast milk is sold at.
The black market is a whole different story. But I think the doctor's world and the parents' world is different. I think they are successfully able to prescribe vitamin D, even though it costs money as an additive, and parents religiously give it. We did it for our kids. Maybe that would have been one route, but that's a different story. And you talked something about making tons of your product. That means scaling. Were you going to make everything in-house? I think I've seen some partnerships. And how did that play out? What did the interactions with potential partners look like? What worked and what did not work while interacting with the potential partners?
We quickly realized that it would take us an absurd amount of money to build facilities and own facilities of our own. So we quickly realized that we wanted a partner in the manufacturing side. In-person meetings worked really, really well. It was one of my first experience to having a lot of business development, partnership conversations. And whenever things would slowly progress over a phone call or an online Zoom call or something, and then once we visited them in person, things would be speeding up. So it was very interesting to me that really it's the human interactions behind these partnership conversations that drive the deal forward. So I learned a lot about deal making. And also the tough thing for us was that COVID happened during the middle of it. We were planning on going to Wuhan actually.
Oh, wow.
In 2020, February. Yes, Wuhan specifically. Yeah. When that was canceled, we tried to go to Shanghai even, but that was also pretty difficult by that time. So COVID was definitely a big deterrent in us setting up different partnerships.
Let's learn in deal making. Can you elaborate more on that if anything stands out?
Deal making, it's an art, but I actually really enjoyed the business development side of it. And that is the specific area where you really need experts who've done this before. It also really helps because I stand out in a lot of companies where I would be meeting with executives who are a lot older and are oftentimes male as well. And I think it helped for them to interact with similar types of people from our side as well, and not just with the person who's very, very different from them. So I think it helped close up, I would just roughly call it the cultural gap. So I had my VP of business development along with me traveling every time. It really also helps to have a second person when you're negotiating as well. But in many other aspects, this is the one area where I would highly recommend bringing on a person who has more experience and actually can deliver a different part than what you can bring. And also a very people-friendly person because there's a lot of people-related aspects in terms of deal making.
I agree. That is so important. I think most industries are filled with gray hair, white men. Nothing against them, but it is what it is. And I think they don't understand the diversity aspects of it and maybe dealing with a younger founder. I think there's some education needed at that front. I think we talked about a lot of things, and I wanted to touch upon your LinkedIn post that came out recently when you mentioned to the world that you're shutting down. Very sad, but I think there were 3 takeaways. Let's go down one by one. Take real breaks and vacations. Talk more about it. How crazy was the startup life and how did you come to that conclusion?
Again, I think this is related to my background. During high school, I went to this high school in Korea that had very high standards. So I take the school bus at 6:30 a.m., go to school, and then the school bus out left the school at 10 p.m. I would come back home, take a brief nap, and then study some more, and then go to bed. So I come from a culture where push, 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 and they praise people for pushing that much. So without a second thought, that's what I did with the company. Not to mention that it was really fun too. I genuinely enjoyed a lot of aspects of running a startup. So it was really fun, and I'm a person who likes to push themselves. So it just collided, and that ended up in pretty interesting results. For the first year running the company, I lost so much weight. I weigh about 20 pounds more right now than
Wow.
I did back then.
Nobody can see you on the video, but wow.
I started having really severe health problems when I was down to 2 digit in terms of pounds. Started having a lot of hormonal issues as well because I didn't have time to eat. And I was like, I can do a little bit more work versus go get lunch. Okay, more work. Was how I treated myself the first year. So, but then with my health problems becoming so severe, I fixed that after a year. And I was like, okay, I got to eat. I got to keep my weight above a certain level. But then still the pushing hard part didn't stop. And I didn't really take any real vacations for a very long time. And by the end of 2021, I was very, very burnt out to the point where I couldn't describe. And I asked myself, is this even real? Because it's in your head. It's not a physical problem that I could tangibly see. So I'm like, am I just making excuses? Or is this a real problem that I have? And it's only when I winded down the company and took a real break and came back from that break and noticing the difference in how I feel right now versus how I was feeling back then was when I realized, oh shit, it was a real mental problem that I had. And those weren't just excuses. I was legitimately not doing so well.
That's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reality of it. A lot of immigrant founders do really well in this country because of that pushing. I think I've gone through a similar experience with my education process too. And then we just give our everything. And at some point, you realize that maybe you need to take some break. We're not used to taking breaks or going on vacations growing up in Asia. But that's a big lesson. And then you still get the shit from investor like, oh, you're a PhD, as if like you're an inferior creature or something. It's an advantage. We worked so hard. We had to cross the visa processes. We survive, we thrive and do well. I think that's the lesson I want to send to the investors. Hope it sticks. Maybe that's a point we also want to talk about the lack of any training in terms of the real world. A startup world for sure, in your grad school or any part of your education, anything in terms of your wishes that could change so that we can prepare our scientists better to start companies, because nobody gives a damn about your research other than you as in like any scientist. And you publish and then move on as if nobody cares. And because nobody cares, it's on us to take that and do something about it. If there's a wish list, because I talk to other founders and aspiring founders, we should be able to inbuild these things early on.
I don't really have so long of a wish list. Maybe just being exposed to people who told me that scientists could easily become entrepreneurs as well. I think we as scientists are biased because the learnings that we went through required so much effort and required so much training so that I believe that, oh, surely the people with MBA backgrounds or surely the people who have true business backgrounds will have an edge. And I surely couldn't do that without going through the same thing. But I think business is very different. So where business, you actually cannot learn from books. You have to be up there and experience the real world and in a very relevant industry and in a very relevant role. I think some roles are very, very different as well. In order to be better at it versus science, you have to go through certain educations. You have to read books to learn that. So I think it's very different. And because I just assumed a lot of things would be similar and that because I didn't go to business school, I would not be able to become a business person. I think those stigmas were also in my head. So I wish I had someone telling me that, no, it's very different and you don't learn business from books. It's what I wish I had been told. And also I wish at the times when I was running the company, even though my PhD research really directly had nothing to do with the company that I was running, I did notice some of the aspects of how I was running the company that was only possible because I went through a PhD. For example, I know that experiments take a long time.
They've failed most of the time.
It's not trivial. Whereas I had people within the company who couldn't quite understand why that was. I actually really, really understood it quite well. I really understood how hard it is to work in a lab and how important that environment is. Versus if I hadn't gone through a PhD, then I couldn't have done it. I also know how some data should be presented and how hidden meanings can be derived from data processing as well. So I feel like those are really life skills. It's like math in a way, because we learn a lot of math, but they're not actually directly applicable in real life. But then it does give you a way of thinking that you might have not otherwise had. So I feel like my PhD was like learning math, where it's not real life truly applicable, but it did ingrain with me a certain set of skills that I would have not been able to get from otherwise.
Absolutely. You being a scientist, I think if you're a business lead, you would ask for a timeline. When can I have this product? Because they don't have an understanding of how experiments might fail. And you being a scientist really helps with that empathy aspect of it and being practical that more than likely it's going to fail. It's not a point of being optimistic. It can be all optimistic all you want, but then you know that experiments fail. They're hard. And I think having somebody at the head really helps building that culture, which is supportive, as opposed to being, you can curse them out, your experiment failed, you're a failure. I think that is really important for these deep tech companies. And that's a good takeaway. Moving along, the second point for you was prioritizing. That's one of the lessons you mentioned on your LinkedIn post. Talk more about it. What were you doing not so right in terms of prioritizing?
Again, I think this is related to my upbringing. Where I like to be a perfectionist. And I just wasn't used to not responding to people right away. I'm the type of person before startup, I get a text and I would respond right away. I get an email, I respond right away. And that was my default level. And having too many things to do, so that wasn't possible anymore, it was just very, very stressful to me. And it made me run around like a headless chicken sometimes. And I think it took me a lot of effort to sit down with myself and tell myself that objectively, this is more than I'm not going to be able to finish all those tasks. But what I'm going to do is really prioritize and focus on the ones that really matter. As much as I try to tell that to myself, sometimes if people's emotions played a role, for example, if an investor calls me up really angry or sad or very emotional, my natural instinct would be to really spend more time on it because I don't want to hurt that person and I want to really help that person versus looking at it objectively. I might have had other more high prioritized things to do. So that was really hard because a lot of times, and in that moment, the priority isn't so clear until you take a step back.
That's a very important lesson. I still struggle with it. I think theoretically we talk about, yes, we should prioritize, but I think, like you said, maybe it's the upbringing. If somebody asks for something, your instinct is to like respond immediately, drop everything and help that person, which isn't really helpful. I need to work on that. I hope other founders are taking notes. And the last point was, it's just a company. What did he mean by that?
I just heard another founder say that her company is her baby. And that's what I described it as. I don't have a kid, but it was the first time when I felt like I had no choice but to do something. And it felt to me like almost having a baby. When the company needed me, It doesn't matter if I'm sleepy. It doesn't matter if I'm sick. I needed to do it. No
Hmm.
choice. There would be a 0 second of thinking between should I do it or should I not? I would just do it. And that was a thing. And it was a behavior that I've never seen in myself before. So it scared me. And then I think in the first few years, I leaned into it. And then as a company started not doing well, it drove me crazy because my baby was dying. And ultimately, while I think it is very hard to be dedicated to a company, it is not your baby. Companies are born, companies die, and it's okay. It's really not your baby. And it's just a company at the end of the day. And that line of separation between the company and you also lets you have your real life, things outside the company that you enjoy and cultivate, and relationships as well. So I think that's very important because you will feel too sad if the company's not doing well. And it really
Yes.
doesn't help.
I've heard this lesson from almost every founder who's gone through the journey. I think the last one I was talking to was John Waldison and Dave Kishore of Lucira, who took the company public and then still had to file for bankruptcy after building such a company, right? And what they mentioned was tying your identity to these startup companies. It's you and it's your baby. And hindsight, it didn't matter if they were 24/7 or if they slept for a few hours. Nothing would have changed that outcome. And most founders are going to be putting their heart into it. They're not doing just because it's money or something, because we're trying to solve a problem. It's still hard, even with my babies. I have two. I still founded a new company and I feel like it's going to be my baby again. And I really need to separate myself out from that. But that's a super important lesson. Even though the company went the way it did, what I feel, I think you're set for much bigger success in your future. It prepared you for the next journey. And before we close down, are there points that we did not discuss that people should know about a startup or NAMUH in the space that you want to discuss?
Well, I do really want to thank you, Naresh, for having me today. And I really don't want to frame this as a failure, but more as a learning experience. And one of my investors very early on asked me, what do you want out of this experience? And my answer was, I want the education equivalent of an MBA program, of a nice MBA program, is what I said. And I certainly got that and so much more. So I feel like this is actually a win for me to come out on top compared to what I expected to have. And I've met great people along the way. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic.
Cool. Let's go to my traditional closing questions. One is, if there's one or two mistakes that you would avoid at your next startup, or if it's a big no-no for other founders, what would that be?
Oh, so many.
You have the microphone.
Well, I don't want to delve into too much about what has happened wrong, but I would really be careful in setting up equity structures. People have told us that you got to be really careful. And after making some mistakes of my own, here I am saying that, yeah, it really matters.
Say more about that. We didn't touch upon the subject.
I'm trying to share without sharing too much, but it's something that's hard to fix later on. I should put it like that. A lot of times there are mistakes that you can wage yourself out from or fix later on, but I feel like this is one of the areas where it's very hard to fix moving forward. So get advice. Every company is very unique.
A good law firm.
A law firm, preferably with a lawyer who's seen many different types of companies before and really get it set up in the right way.
Equity structures. I hope people are taking notes. And my second question is, are there one or two people or more that you want to acknowledge that really helped you in your journey?
Oh, I have a long list there as well. Well, I first and foremost want to thank my co-founders, Professor Jamie Kate at UC Berkeley. Oh my gosh, I think people share a lot of the time when people co-found their company with professors. I mostly hear horror stories, but I only have good things to share about Jamie. And he's been so supportive of me. And he has also made a lot of effort in learning how to become an effective board member as well. So yeah,
I heard great things about Jamie too.
He's been really good. And I really hope to start another company with him sometime in the future, if that is possible. And then the other person would be my CTO, Paula Hicks. She is a beast. Yeah. She has been the savior for the company. And I'm very grateful that I met her. And it was really because of her that our technology really matured and got developed into something that would be industrially meaningful. Otherwise, I think we would have just made a lot of easy newbie mistakes. And she's just a great person to hang out with.
Chaeyoung, this was fascinating. Thank you for sharing the story of NAMUH with us. I'm sure there are a lot of lessons for the audience. Listen to this, definitely for me. And I wish you lots of good luck and success in the future. But I think what you got was much, much, much more than a good MBA. You'll relish this a few years down the lane. I wish you lots of good luck. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Naresh.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.